Hello, my name is Julius Baer, Editor-in-Chief of Professional Wealth Management. I'd like to welcome you to the Financial Times headquarters here today. And our topic is the future of banking, in particular private banking and wealth management. There's been a lot of talk in the UK and in Switzerland about potentially splitting off commercial banks from investment banks. You'd have the private and retail banks in one unit, the high-rolling investment bankers in another unit. To discuss this concept, I have with me today Kath Tillotson. She's one of the founders of Scorpio Partnership, a wealth management think tank. Hello, Kath. Nice to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Yuri.
Now, if we can start with the UK, Kath, politicians such as Vince Cable, they're calling for a split between these so-called high-rolling investment bankers and the more retail-led organisations which provide our mortgages, savings, and also, let's not forget, the big wealth management units for affluent clients. The likes of Bob Diamond here at Barclays are under huge pressure in the media with a strong public consensus that the investment bankers have somehow contaminated our retail and commercial banks, and they've affected the very stability of the banks. Do you see significant regulatory or commercial pressure which will encourage and eventually force institutions to perhaps look at splitting off private banking and retail banking from the capital markets and investment banking side?
Well, you're asking two questions there. There's effectively the question about regulation, and there's also a question about on the commercial side, and those are two completely separate issues. And even within regulation, I think there are two issues here. I mean, first of all, in order to determine whether separating commercial banking from investment banking makes economic sense, we need to fully understand the net economic benefit that an organisation like Barclays brings to the UK. And I think that while we can simplify that argument, it is actually very complex in terms of impact on the local economy as well as impact in, more broadly into other sectors such as wealth management, asset management, and the impact in the tax environment. I think there's also a separate issue about Barclays, as the example that you've given, is the role of our banking sector in the international stage. And this is not just a question of what happens here in the UK. There are global repercussions to any regulatory activity that happens here, which, the last thing we want is to put our banking sector at a global economic disadvantage. So I think from the regulatory side, there are actually some fairly complex issues at play here. And I think it'll be some time before we get clarity, because every banking institution here and around the world is different, and it's very difficult to get a one-size-fits-all solution to this particular problem. So I think that's, on the regulatory side, a key point. I think on the commercial side, banking entities are commercial entities, and through the crisis it became starkly clear that the counter-cyclical nature of investment banking and wealth management made it very advantageous to have both operations within the same commercial entity. Effectively, for a long period of time, it was wealth management that was supporting investment banking, whereas prior to the crisis, obviously, investment banking had been doing considerably better in overall revenue terms and profitability terms, potentially, than wealth management had been. And this counter-cyclical nature of wealth management, which is something that is very attractive to the universal banking sector in that model.
But what works best for the customer, Kath? We've seen 3 years ago, Jörg Zeltner, the boss of private banking at UBS, he did a huge mea culpa speech at one of our conferences that about the mis-selling of structured products. We created far too many of these products. We sold them to the wrong audience. They were incorrectly hedged. I mean, it was a huge admission of guilt there. And there was the perception before that the private banks were just there to distribute these investment banking products. Is that good for the customer? That we've seen the UBS and Credit Suisse, they both have huge units of former investment bankers who are there to source products from the group for private clients. Is this in the ultimate interests of the customer?
I think the question reflects the banking sector and the way it operates today. I think both are making big assumptions about what a typical customer is and what a typical customer wants. And I think, you know, a lot of the research we do is with end customers, and they don't come in one single variety. You know, there is no doubt that there are circumstances under which financially engineered products of one sort or another are appropriate to the customer. The question here is one of appropriateness. You know, what you don't want to see is products that are put in client portfolios without their knowledge, without their consent, or without their understanding. If these new units that are being set up to source those products are doing so appropriately and are educating relationship managers and clients about the benefits, and those products are going into client portfolios with a reason and with consent, then they are providing an effective solution for a particular customer's need. But when wholesale products get, for want of a better word, dumped into portfolios because it's financially expedient for the bank, then that's an activity that obviously has been found not only sorely wanted but perhaps ethically questionable. And I think a lot of regulators are particularly concerned about that whole area. And transparency in the UK is one of the topics that the regulator is tackling very forcefully at the moment.
Because of course there is another option here. With the big two in Switzerland, Credit Suisse and UBS, having that universal model which they say is the way forward. We've also got the number 3 institution gradually rising up the scale, Julius Baer. I mean, they've exited investment banking, they've exited asset management. They're purely concentrating on private banking. They claim that this is for the customer's benefit. Is that true, or are they being slightly disingenuous here? Is it a case that they might not have succeeded so well in the other disciplines or with the integrated model, so they're going for what they call the pure play private banking model?
I think what this comes back to again is the fact that there's no typical customer. Following the crisis, there are a lot of customers who are much more conscious about the kind of institutions that they're happy to work with. And you see that reflected in two kinds of behaviour. Some of them are moving towards institutions that they regard as independent from product decisions. So they would prefer an entity that has an independent view of the market and has not necessarily got in-house asset management or any other kind of product that they can introduce into the portfolio. I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is that clients also have become more sophisticated to select more than one kind of institution, recognising that different business models have their different strengths and weaknesses. And if you want to access what's best in the market, it's perhaps better to diversify across a number of different kinds of provider. So I think there's room for both. And again, it reflects the fact that there is no such thing as typical customer behaviour. Different customers like different solutions, frankly, for different problems. And it's not unusual for one customer to want to have more than one kind of wealth management solution. I think particularly in the case of Julius Baer, it's interesting because it reflects more broadly what's going on in the Swiss market. As the Swiss market becomes much more international following, the impact of the pressure from the US government, it is starting to have to look at a different way of operating on the international stage, on more of a level playing field than perhaps it's had in the past, and that is certainly a debatable point. But if this common ground is in place, then banks and private banks have to be much more conscious about how they differentiate to end customers. And I think Julius Baer has taken a very smart decision about how specifically it wants to attract customers from the international market to this private banking model called Swiss private banking.
Julius Baer has also named Asia as its second home market. It's competing with the likes of DBS, Standard Chartered, the big Pan-Asian institutions, also its Swiss counterparts, and there's plenty of other smaller Swiss players going into Asia with all guns blazing. Can they all succeed there, or will we just see a real cull and the survival of the fittest in that market which is currently so in vogue?
Well, Asia's a very interesting market, and I think a lot of the data that's come out on market sizing recently has highlighted the point that Asia is, in terms of high net worth wealth, on an equal footing with Europe and catching up quickly with the US. So it's a very big market, and again, there's room for different kinds of models. I think what's interesting, coming back to Julius Baer and the other Swiss private banks operating in the Asian market is that there is a place for this brand of Swiss private banking. And I think it's again an interesting move on Julius Baer's point to try and differentiate within that very distant market from Europe. It's a very long way away from Switzerland, but in order to differentiate and create a unique brand for Swiss private banking against the noise of perhaps some of these larger universal banks or commercial banks that have also turned up, put their flag in the sand and started trading.
Well, Kath, thank you so much for coming here today and sharing your views with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.